All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Quick thumbs up. All right, perfect. Okay, so welcome and thank you for joining the event Scaling Change from Local Projects to Landscape Level Impact. Super great to see so many people joining today. Before we get started, I wanted to quickly introduce myself and our speaker, Vanessa Coronado. So my name is Ruth Peltz. I'm a Terra.do LFA alumni, and I was part of the Dingoes group back in October 2023. It was a great experience that I wanted to become an ambassador for this great community. My background is in sustainability and customer success, with over a decade of experience in CPG and climate tech and global tech. And most recently, I led sustainability programs at Regrow Ag, where I partnered with agribusinesses and food companies to implement regenerative agriculture programs. I am super excited to be here with Vanessa Coronado today. A little bit about Vanessa. So Vanessa Coronado has built a 13-year career at the intersection of public policy, sustainable development, and social impact. Her work spans Colombia's environmental, agricultural, and energy sector, where she has driven initiatives ranging from public-private partnerships and stakeholder engagement to indigenous consultations and strategic risk management. From co-founding the Plataforma de Diálogos Improbables, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, to leading complex sustainability projects, Vanessa has consistently focused on creating solutions that serve both communities and ecosystems. Welcome, Vanessa. Excited to be here with you. So before I
Thank,
hand it, so go ahead.
no, thank you very much for the introduction, and you did pronounce it very well.
Thank
Your
you.
Spanish is really good.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, before I hand it over to Vanessa, just a few housekeeping rules. If you have a question in between the presentation, feel free to raise your hands, and Vanessa will try to answer it in that moment. But if you prefer to wait on your questions at the end of the presentation, which will be about 30 minutes, we'll also have time at the end to answer those questions. Please put them in the QA box and not in the chat, so we make sure we can upload some of the questions. And that's pretty much it. And without further ado, I hand it over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for the kind invitation and this introduction. And thank you all for joining. Good morning from Bogota, Colombia. And good afternoon or evening to those connecting from other parts of the world. Today, I would like to share my journey in the environmental field and how that took me to an experience that shaped how I believe we can best work together to fight climate change and biodiversity loss. So First, let me go back to this picture, the one I used to share my bio with you. The most important highlight of this picture is not me, of course. The most important thing is the fact that that day, I committed myself with the children of Palau to preserve and protect their beautiful island and to leave only footprints that will wash away. I hope that I can travel to Palau, which I've seen pictures and it looks amazing. But I signed this declaration during my first COP, the Conference of Parties in Dubai, in a climate change COP. And that's the magic of environmental work. No matter where you are or what you do, you can still make a difference in fight against climate change. And now let me begin with my personal journey that brought me to this path where environment and development stand at the heart, at the center of decisions making between conservation and development, and a few reflections that I have along the way. This journey has been far away from linear, full of twisted lessons and discoveries. And today, studies and practices on environmental issues may seem obvious. But a few years ago, when I started university, the options for environmental and sustainability studies were not that strong. So I studied government and international relations. But back then, Colombia was facing a tough battle against illicit crops, and the priority was to create environmental or more like livelihoods activities that could help people transition from illicit crops or cultivation to legal productive activities like cocoa or coffee. At that time, environmental consequences of expanding agricultural frontier or promoting monocultures were not at present as they are right now in public debate in this moment. So one thing that I learned when I joined the government in this fight of fighting illicit crops is that people must first have food on the table and feel safe. And when I say safe, I am saying physically safe before they can even prioritize environment and conservation activities. Later on, I joined the Colombia's Ministry of Finance to support the reform of royalty system. For those of you who doesn't know, royalties are a mandatory payment that companies exploiting non-renewable natural resources, such as minerals and hydrocarbons, must make to the states. There, I came to understand the economic importance of the mining and energy sector for countries like Colombia. What's more important of that experience is that as part of the reform, we managed to create a dedicated fund to support the development of environmental projects, to compensate for the impact of the energy and mining projects, and to support transitions towards a more sustainable economy. Another learning that I gained during that time is that clear and consistent public policy signals are really essential to encourage investment in environmental activities. A few years later, I found myself working in an environmental Colombian fund in the heart of the Amazon of Colombia. This was my first time working with biologists, forest engineers, probably some of you are in that path or career, people who really study environmental matters. At that time, I was leading an USAID project called Conservation and Governance. And it was there where I truly understood the power of helping communities or supporting communities strengthen their voices. And the learning for me at that moment was by building the capacity of those local farmers, they become powerful advocates for better land use policies. And I witnessed myself how local leadership can actually shape the future of landscapes, different landscapes around the world. For example, at that time, we worked with small cattle ranchers. And cattle ranching is one of the activities that is closely linked to deforestation in the Amazon region. So with this rancher, we engage across the entire value chain to improve environmental and social practices of production and to improve or strengthen their commercialization. These same cattle ranching that are causing somehow deforestation in the Amazon, they ended having 12 or more natural reserves to protect their forest. And they even registered that natural reserve under the Colombian's national park system. So after this experience, I came into a change that some of my new environmentalist friends did not quite approve of. I moved to the Ministry of Mines and Energy of Colombia. And I was leading the Office of Environmental and Social Affairs. So during my experience, I came to understand that it's possible to promote development of an extractive industry like mining and hydrocarbons, while at the same time following a strict or strong environmental guidelines, policies, and regulation. But I also realized that this requires building capacity with both governments, and local communities. So the oversight of the activity itself can be grounded in evidence of the real impact of the sector in the environment and in the social and in the culture of that specific community or region that the project is being developed. Then I moved to another project with an international NGO, and you, Gerardo, had David Borrandeo a few sessions ago. So we work with indigenous communities across the Amazon basin in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Guyana, and Suriname, and also Brazil, helping to strengthen their administrative and financial capacities. So those indigenous communities could directly access to resources to improve or to support the implementation of their life plans. And working with indigenous communities has been truly inspiring for me. Their visions of development, sustainability, and conservation often differs from the lens that we use from the Western to see different approaches. So at that moment, I realized that some conservation values, like forests or water springs, for example, cannot really be given an economic incentive or value to turn themselves into carbon credits or payment for ecosystem service. Those values probably just need to remain simply in conservation. So that's something that I learned from indigenous communities. And from this project that I led, Impact, that is the international organization, I want to share something like a couple of tools that we adapted to work with indigenous communities. And we adapted in different ways. You will find it in English, in Portuguese, and in a couple of other languages. The tools that we adapted is one that we call ITOCA. It's a technical and organizational capacity assessment. And the other tool is one that we call OPI, the Organizational Performance Index. While the OPI measures changes in organizational performance, the ITOCA helps evaluate technical and organizational capacity for advancing development in an organization. When indigenous organizations are empowered, and that's something that I also learned, and they are empowered to manage their lands and decisions and to be heard and to drive conservation and sustainable strategies, we unlock to conservation strategies that go beyond isolated projects to reach something that we call like landscape scale. And speaking about this, speaking about moving from isolated projects to a landscape scale intervention, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to join the Rainforest Alliance. Some of you may know the organizations, others know this is a nonprofit organization using social and market forces to protect nature and improve lives of farmers and communities. And now I'd like to speak about my experience in the Rainforest Alliance, putting in practice what many practitioners call the landscape approach or the integrated landscape management. And to start from the beginning, what is the landscape approach? Today, we are facing some of the most urgent challenges like climate change, biodiversity loss, food insecurity, social inequity, and land degradation. They are all deeply connected, crossing borders and cutting different sectors. But our responses remain fragmented from individual sectors or value chain or company or by projects that I used to work in. And when problems like climate change are this systemic, siloed solutions are not enough. So while there are many definitions of landscape approach or integrated landscape management, they generally agree that this is a management framework that brings together the action of multiple stakeholders that bring together like systemic, like they combine all what they are doing in order to support themselves in preserving specific challenges or to improve specific challenges that they are facing in the landscape. The landscape approach is put in practice through land use planning, for example, policies, aligned projects, which was my case, long-term investment, and coordinated interventions. And I must say that I fell in love with this concept because it reflects the very essence of nature, offering a holistic way of thinking about development. The 1000 Landscape Initiative offers a practical guide to integrated landscape management or landscape approach. And this is my second gift for you today in this conversation. This guide is a generic conceptual process for carrying out landscape approaches. The process has 5 elements, and at the center, at the heart, we see the landscape partnership, which is a coalition of organizations, communities, companies, governments, in the landscape from different sectors and different interests, with the aim of trying to preserve whatever ecosystem or natural activity they need to in order to continue developing their activities, their economic activities. And we actually aim at the Rainforest Alliance and a few practitioners that I've met during this path to work for this partnership to become formal through an agreement, like a private agreement or even with the government. And this partnership need to share an understanding of the state of the landscape, trends and forecasts, as well as an individual interest and needs. And once we have, like, for doing this, for agreeing on what's happening in the landscape and what is going to continue happening if we don't do anything at different stakeholders that we are gaining interest in that landscape, we use a tool that we call Landscale, which is a holistic assessment tool designed to measure and communicate the sustainability performance of a landscape. And that tool helps us define not only landscape boundaries, but also assess environmental, social, and economic indicators to establish a baseline on how the landscape is at the moment that we are starting our intervention. And going back to the elements that are relevant to build a landscape approach, the partnerships also need to agree upon the objectives across land uses, sectors, and stakeholders to create an understanding and vision on a vision of development for that specific landscape. And for example, one experience that I had being part of the Rainforest Alliance team is that we assessed the Lamas province in Peru a few years ago. And we assessed that province using Landscale, as I was telling you. And this province has the 4th rate of deforestation rate in the region and ranks 25th of nationwide. Since 2001, over 60,000 hectares of forest have been lost, which was an urgent call to rethink conservation and development strategies. The loss of forest in the landscape is almost entirely explained by the expansion of agricultural frontier, at least for this landscape. So the partnership agreed to achieve an equitable and resilient community development through a landscape approach, using the approach that we are sharing today, that aligns local, regional, and national sustainability goals with the Sustainable Development Goals, CSG. On the taking action element, the landscape partnership needs to develop a finance and an integrated landscape investment portfolio of projects and then define a monitoring and learning process. In Lamas, to follow my example, the landscape action plan has 12 goals and 45 actions or projects. One of the goals is to cut annual deforestation by 15% by 2030. To get there, they've included the voluntary conservation agreements between companies, local producers, authorities, and any other local organizations or NGO to channel financial and other kinds of incentives to help restore ecosystem, improve connectivity, and improve production of coffee and cocoa and palm oil as well, which is kind of the main activities, economic activities in the area. The total cost of these actions is estimated in about $30 million over 5 years, which is a lot of money, and we will talk about challenges of this approach in the future in my few slides I have listed. So using the insights from the paper that I have from CDP, and I really encourage you to take a look to CDP if you have done that before. Let me summarize the elements of the landscape approach. First, you need a definition of an area, like the boundaries of your landscape. Second, you need a multi-stakeholder governance process of platform. Third, you need to define a collective vision and goal, and also a financial investment plan for the actions that you want to start implementing as a collective governance body. And fourth, design a monitoring and reporting process. In sum, the landscape approach, through this landscape approach, stakeholders build trust, which is actually really needed in areas where deforestation is growing. You also get to establish a shared understanding of the landscape needs and challenges, and work to reconcile different objectives for coordinated and mutually reinforcing actions between different stakeholders. For governments and for companies as well, that have commitments to nature, whether it's on deforestation, smallholders' livelihoods, climate mitigation, or other areas, engaging with the landscape approach can be powerful, and a powerful way to achieve those goals effectively. In fact, companies often use this approach to advance environmental objectives, followed by social, production, and governance goals. And this is why the number of companies and states disclosing their engagement in landscape approach initiative to CDP have been experiencing a consistent growth, as you can see in the graphics there in the presentation. But we are not there yet. I mean, we need still to work a lot. And I hope you can take this information and reflect on this and use to advocate for this approach in your work. Another final gift for you. On this page that I'm showing, also from CDP, you can find more information on what our landscape approaches are, see their growing adoption, and get a framework and tools for credible implementation and reporting. Hope you can take a look to these resources. And of course, it's not all sunshine and roses. I think you use that in English. When it comes to making landscape approaches effectively, we have found some challenges based on our own experience implementing this. For example, lack of reliable data and collective monitoring systems, which make it difficult to measure progress, and progress at scale, not just at projects specifically. We also see that governance is not always inclusive. Some voices carry more weight than others, and governments are not consistently engaged with this process. In our experience, for example, Llamas in Peru is a landscape with a strong government participation, while in Colombia, civil society and producers organizations play a more prominent role. And in Brazil, the process is largely driven by companies. So this shows that the level of engagement of the stakeholders will vary, of course, depending on the region. Another challenge is that many initiatives remain too small in scale, focusing only on farms or projects or supply chain, rather than the whole landscape. At the same time, collective goals are not always clear, with actions that are still tied really closely to individual companies' objectives rather than to the whole landscape. And finally, finance is a really huge barrier. We at Rainforest Alliance, we have been working with, especially in Colombia and in Peru, supporting local organizations build their capacity to access private investment and financial resources from financial institutions. Sometimes this even means supporting the organizations, the local organizations, putting together business plans or investment proposals. So we are still struggling with channeling investment with this huge vision of landscape approach. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. And I hope this has been some quite inspiring for you. And back to you, Ruth. I'm be happy to hear some reflections.
Awesome. This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Vanessa. We do have some questions in the Q&A. I will get to those first, and if there's any remaining questions from the audience, feel free to go on mute and ask them directly. All right, so the first one is in regards to Bogotoga Cicloruto and Medellin's Green Corridors Urban Greening Initiatives are both inspiring. Can you speak about how these programs serve the community and public investment in eco-stewardship is a scalable model for climate action? Frankly, I'd like to see the US not rely upon exploiting the goodwill of nonprofits and volunteers, but instead pay for these necessary improvements. Thanks. And this comes from Pacific Beach Coalition. And if you have anything to add to that question, feel free to do that.
Since this is a really small group, I will invite Pacific Beach Coalition to just open their mic and speak a little bit about that question specifically. If they want to, of course. I'm trying, Ruth.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think, yeah, it just took a little bit.
So in Bogota, they have this amazing bike infrastructure. It's incredible. They did it in the 90s, right? Medellin, they have these green corridors. So think of like public greenways, and they also have a workforce development contingent of that, where they are paying locals to maintain it. So the idea of these co-benefits and these outcomes of public investment is something I think that many places could learn from. Here, there's always a lot of talk about trying to find volunteers, and can we find volunteers to pull weeds and water and stuff like that. And I think, there's a switch that can be made as far as the value of some of these climate actions. And I just wanted to ask about that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's kind of different, the rural scenario than the one that we have in the cities. And ultimately, we are all looking to reduce emissions, like to this bike that we are calling. And the way we're thinking about landscape approach probably is more tied on how to develop value chains that are more consistently connected to what the landscape needs. So let's try to think about a different area than Bogota, which is a capital city, or Medellin, the one that you just mentioned, and try to think of another different rural area in Colombia or any other area that important companies, are sourcing from their commodities. So if different companies are sourcing commodities from that specific area and they don't align themselves and they don't speak to each other, what we have found is that in a few years, due to climate change, we will run out of water, forest, or whatever or other conservation value that we have in the area. So our call is really to try to coordinate activities in that specific area. So of course, that is not that is also connected to what we are doing in the cities, like Bogota and Colombia. And there, of course, we have a huge public investment, as you mentioned as well, and private investment in a sense of making possible for people to actually rent bicycle to travel from one place to another, or different type of policy incentive, which I also mentioned are really relevant for any type of environmental activity. Like, for example, a few years ago, we tried to have something in Bogota that if you travel in a car to the center of the city, which is really crowded at specific times, you will need to have more than one person in your vehicle in order to get a discount. Otherwise, you will need to pay an amount. I don't remember. I don't think we are culturally, at least from what I learned, in that position of paying, like for if I'm just driving by myself and don't getting anyone. But we are getting there in order to understand that, and that's take me to my specific, one of my first slides is like, no matter what you do, you can always bring something to the table when we're speaking to emissions, when we're speaking about conservation activities, or even when you are buying something at grocery store. If you want to refer to a product that has a seal that can guarantee you that you have conservation and social and human resources behind the seal, that if you decide to go by that, then you are setting a standard for the market. It's all about market signals and also how we as consumer do something, and also how we as part of organizations, companies, can also adapt policies and instruments that can incentivize people to prefer conservation rather than any other type of practices, or in this case, type of transportation. If you have the right incentive, you will prefer to ride in a way that will produce probably less emissions than in another way. That will be my takeaway. Although we are not promoting landscape approaches in big cities because it's kind of different, probably the process.
Does this answer your question and also reflect the third one? I know there was another question that you had, talking to a specific beach coalition. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, so I'm just using that term. Does it answer your question? Okay, perfect. Yes. Okay. Okay, we have another question around landscape assessment from Tillman. And I imagine that there may be challenges of making landscape assessments in areas that have been heavily impacted by human activity for a long time. So he's interested to know, how do you overcome those challenges to get an accurate assessment of a landscape's true potential? That's a very interesting question.
Yes, it is indeed, and thank you. Before I dive deep into the answer, one thing that we encounter in doing this assessment using this tool, and I'm sure there's a lot of different tools, like as I mentioned, we use Landscale, is that the tools invites you to use the formal or the information that the government has already published. So you have this national information, like a higher level information, and sometimes information from quite a few years ago, not the current, like the time that you are assessing. So one thing that we still need to solve is on how to actually invest resources on having indicators and assessment of the real time and the scale that you need in order to make decisions. So what we did is to invite local stakeholders from university, from producers organizations, and from the government to discuss these national numbers that we have. So they can tell us, well, the number is not the same, it has changed, the baseline looks kind of fuzzy because we have been seeing this and that happening in the region. But we still have, at least in what I've seen in Colombia and in Peru and in Indonesia as well, we have seen that the information that is available for stakeholders to make decisions on is still too high level and probably from a few years ago. So that's one challenge of that question, and it's a challenge that we already face. So ultimately, what we agree, and it's a window that landscape have, is to invite local stakeholders that are recognized in the region to actually review the numbers and provide some input. So we have like a second tier revision of the landscape assessment with local people or organizations, so that we can kind of try to align what we have at the national level available and then at the local level. So that's the way we have found a way through work through these. I don't think that's kind of the ultimate answer. At least in these countries, in this region, we still need to work on how to make information more available for people to make decisions, and information that is really at small scale. Because if I'm a farmer and I'm taking water from some watershed nearby me, I need to have information on who else is taking water from that, for example, and what is going to happen with us in the future because of climate change scenarios. But we don't have that information yet, and that's probably one of the things, and I think I mentioned that, one of the things that is stopping us to all conveniently work in this landscape approach, because of information, lack of specific information at the landscape level. And I had some feedback of someone working in a finance impact organization, and she told me, well, I think this landscape approach is really good for us to invest in, because we have different companies that are sourcing from that specific landscape, but we don't have specific information on how our investment is going to impact the specific area where that company is sourcing from. So again, it goes back to the part of information and the level and the scale of information. And it's really expensive for local organizations or even governments to have that. Probably in some cases, they will need to deploy monitoring people to gather the information and the resources for that, specifically in area when producers are really spread away in different areas, is really costly. Yeah.
Thank you. Did that answer your question, Tillman?
Yeah, thank you. No, it's very interesting here that you're sort of locally validating the information that you're sourcing centrally. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that question. All right, we still have some time and 2 more questions, so we'll get through those as well and see if we have more after this. So there was another question from Patrick from Pacific Beach Coalition, and he was interested to know, what can we learn about the fight against deforestation by supporting Indigenous stewardship and forest guardians? How can that best translate to other bioregional contexts?
That's a really good question, Patrick. And I will say that, first of all, there are value conservation for Indigenous communities that, as I just mentioned in the presentation, they need to keep as conservation value areas. And we have one example here in Colombia. We have kind of the second national protected area in the whole continent. And I was part of the government when we had this discussion with the mining or the hydrocarbon companies and Indigenous communities and local communities as well. So what we saw at the government at that time is that we have a huge potential for a hydrocarbon development in the area of that park, around that area of the park. And on the other side, what we learned from Indigenous communities is that was really relevant for cultural and conservation purposes. So the decision that it was made by the government And it was like a dialogue conversation, because that's really relevant for indigenous communities, is that the government decided to preserve and expand the area of the national park instead of opening it up to hydrocarbon companies. And it's kind of between in the middle of politics, policy, and government decisions. So supporting indigenous communities to advocate, to gain understanding on how Western decisions are made was really relevant at that time when I had the opportunity to work with them, because they really influence decisions of the government, as the one that I'm telling you about right now. And the other way is that the other thing that I will say is, like, indigenous communities, at least in my experience, they are thinking about conservation as a matter of something that will give you benefits in the long run. And otherwise, we as Western, as they call us, we are thinking about how to get benefit at the moment, in the present. So we still need to work out or sort out on how to establish this balance between conservation and development, on how to develop economic incentives where they are appropriate in order to conserve and at the same time develop whatever we need to develop to continue growing at the same time.
Thank you, Vanessa. So we have a few more questions coming in. So the next one is from Daniela. She's asking, most of the times in projects where we need the collaboration of the government and communities, it is difficult to get to agreements and agile action of implementation. What approaches or actions have worked in your experience to overcome this challenge?
Thank you, Daniela. And I think you get to one point, that promoting this landscape approach is not something that is going to have in the window of a project or even a government. So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to speak with a palm oil company, and the sustainable advisor of the company was part of this huge event that we were speaking about landscape approaches. And she was like, I like certifications. The RSPO certification for palm oil is relevant. We like UDR, which is this policy from the European Union to promote free deforestation products. And I like the landscape approach, but they are all taking too long. And I cannot risk of not having a product tomorrow to sell to my market. And yes, in my experience, I've been working with Rainforest Alliance for almost 3 years, working around these landscape approaches. And I cannot tell you, to be totally honest, that they are already in place to continue promoting this approach in the future. So it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of efforts, and something that you might find in the tools that I share with you today is something that we call the capital continuum of the process. You will have a first activities about convening people, defining the baseline, going to one of the questions, defining the common vision that you will need non-reimbursable funds to start that process. And that's part of our responsibility, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And then you will have specific activities and actions where other type of funds may come in. And impact investors particularly are really interested in actually seeing in impact of their investment beyond value change. But that's something that still some companies are still looking on how to navigate the process. So it's not that we have an answer specifically for that. We are also transitioning from projects that gives us resources to move them to this kind of broader vision of landscape approach. And the quite few experience that I heard of on how this landscape is moving forward without investment from governments and grants has taken like 7 or 8 years. Because building trust and defining a vision, a common vision on how we are going to use resources from specific areas, whether if you are a mining company or a cocoa company or chocolate company, takes time. Yeah, I mean, you need a lot of effort in order to put this specific framework in place. But we have seen from CDP quite a few companies, and we have been growing. Like 3 or 4 years ago, when we started engaging with this concept with CDP, there were like 20 companies that they actually disclosed that they were doing something related to a landscape. And then and now we have more than 300 companies like far away. So that's in 3 years, a lot of course, the time is not good enough because the pressure on climate is going up, and then our responses are going probably slower than we need to. But there in that nature page that I share, you will find like how the evolution of number of companies and states, because you also need policies that allows companies and stakeholders to actually engage in this type of mechanisms to build a different development path for the specific regions.
Thank you very much. We have one last question that is at least in the Q&A, and then there's other questions after that, but we can certainly take that from the audience too. It's kind of going in a similar direction. So Ethan would like to know, he'd like to chat about how you get momentum for initiatives like this landscape approach in a new area. So in his case, he's looking to do this collation building type work and has been working on himself in this area while looking for partners to work with. And he's curious to know how you found the momentum and the funding and what your approach is when the infrastructure for this collation needs to be rebuilt or built for the first time.
Thank you for that question. I'm not sure if this answer is going to be really like inspirational, but I will say that the momentum is when you see climate change scenarios. And we go back to the question of Patrick on the baseline. That's why the baseline is really important, because you see where you are right now, and you see where you are coming from, and you see the future, and you say, well, if we all continue doing what we are doing, we are, let's say, run out of water in a few years. And that's evidence. I mean, it's grounded in evidence. It's not different. And people, and that's where communities are really relevant. They all know what's happening. So for me, at least, the moment in Lamas in Peru is where we realize, based on the land scale study or assessment, that productivity was going down instead of going up. And we gather the community and the stakeholders and show the data, and they say, yeah, it's true. We have been using different kind of tools to gather water, but rainy seasons and rainy and not rainy seasons, so they are impacting. So that's a moment where you can use knowledge, information, and evidence to engage different type of stakeholders. And then you need to go to companies, and I'm sure we have all seen multiple different studies where companies are including climate change as part of the risk in decision-making processes. So that's where you can connect the need of actually doing something at a landscape process or a scale, and not at the specific value change process. But that, again, even if you are seeing that you are losing productivity, that will take time to actually connect everybody. And if we are speaking about this particular region, we also have these different politics and security issues that we also need to take care of. while speaking about landscape approaches and responsible sourcing from big companies. So this is just one part, if I'm allowed to say it. The landscape approach, of course, is the whole landscape, but then you need to actually try to get the pieces together, because companies, and then you have a different buyers, and then you have the specific producer, and they all need to be part of this conversation. And again, going to Daniela's point, that takes times and also resources. And we have been luckily positioned to gain resources from grants from the international cooperation and international development organizations to start the process. We are still far away from seeing momentum from just companies, for example, or governments themselves financing the opportunity to start a process where they can say we are building a vision of development beyond our own value chain.
Thank you so much for that. Excuse me. Thank you so much for that answer. Before we go to the last question, Jeff is asking, can we share the deck? Vanessa, are you comfortable in sharing the deck so we can send that out later?
Totally.
Yeah, we will send it out.
Just from you. Yeah.
Yeah. So we will send it out with the follow-up email. So you will have the deck to run through that again if you're interested. And is there any question from the audience live right now? Feel free to come off mute.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So I was really fascinated in the middle of your presentation. You had talked about working with Indigenous people, and there was a pivot, inflection point where they were not only able to work on very specific projects with you, but then they were empowered to essentially do the work on their own and contribute in this greater, bigger picture. And I was wondering if you could give kind of an example of that transition and the work, and like how that looks now as those different Indigenous groups are working independently. Are they still working together? I'm just curious. Thanks.
Thank you. And yes, they are. And they managed to receive funds directly from UNDP, which was really like kind of a milestone for us, because one of the points is that if Indigenous communities cannot access resources from themselves, we have then different layers to translate what they want to do in their lands or territories to continue these conservation strategies. So they managed to access funds directly, and they are working together. And they have a huge challenge against illegal mining, which is like affecting their territory and somehow their livelihoods. So we continue in communication, and it was something that I did with PACT, another NGO, not the Rainforest Alliance. So we continue in communication with them to try to support them in providing information on how illegal mining is affecting these indigenous territories, and sharing information on so they can advocate with grounded information of what's happening there, and also trying to provide more input on how to develop livelihoods for their territories that could help to survive this illegal moment that is affecting their territory. So yeah, that's what we did at that moment, and it was kind of the purpose of the project. But we were thinking about the project, and they were thinking about the territory. So that's how you transition from specific actions to a more holistic way of seeing what is happening in the area. So we were just trying to improve their capacity of managing resources from an international organization, and they were thinking beyond that. They were thinking on how those resources will help them overcome this illegal moment and activities that are occurring in the Amazon right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. I think we have one last question from Patrick. Thanks for all your contributions, Patrick, today. So he's asking, are we ready for COP30 in Belém, Brazil? Interesting dynamic in having to consider infrastructure challenges for the host. The idea of dredging the river to allow cruise ships for lodging participants begs the question about considering impacts from even best intent. So what is your take on that? I think he's more asking for a personal opinion from you.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited. I mean, we came from a COP, biodiversity COP in Colombia, and it was really challenging for us. I heard a lot of comments about security, and I heard a lot of comment on Colombia not being able to host a lot of people coming in. And it turned out being fantastic. And we gained a lot of like visibility, of course, but as well people, like regular people, understood what biodiversity was. So that's a gain for me. We as organization gain a few new partners from that COP the time we participated. So I need to be positive. Is always positive to have people from other countries coming to this area, taking a look to specific challenges that we are facing in the Amazon. Is a huge political challenge that the government of Brazil took. And we are also participating, of course. We will be traveling and host a few events with a few partners. So we will see. I mean, there is a lot of people coming. I'm not quite sure what is the result of the COPs. But as long as it's help us gain visibility and engage more people in what we're facing and connecting with others like we are doing right now is good enough for me at this point. So we will see. And Brazil is really particularly, at least from what I have learned from Brazil, is like they have huge area of the Amazon, but they have a lot of companies there. And someone said something about value change and companies, and they are eager to have answers quickly. And when we're speaking about environment, that's something that takes time. So it's really going to be relevant to see how they are willing to invest in something that is going to take time to see, like conservation and deforestation, like battle. So we will see what happens. So hope to see you there, Patrick, as well.
Thank you all, and thank you, Vanessa. Thanks for all the contribution and great question from the audience. We're right at time, so I will leave it at this. Vanessa, again, thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hopefully see you again sometime, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks for joining. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.